August 30th, 1945. The Pacific stretched out in every direction, gray and endless, a sea that had swallowed years of war. Now it carried something different: surrender. On the deck of a U.S. Navy transport ship, a group of Japanese women stood huddled together. Their clothes were thin, their eyes weary, their bodies swaying with the slow rhythm of the ocean. Some had once been nurses on far-flung islands. Others had worked as clerks or teachers before the war dragged them into uniform. A few had simply been civilians, trapped in the chaos of surrender. They had grown up with propaganda posters warning them that Americans were monsters, giants with claws and fangs, demons who would tear them apart if captured. And yet here they were, guarded not by beasts, but by young American sailors in pressed khaki uniforms. The women watched silently as the sailors walked the deck. These were boys, many no older than themselves, farm sons from Iowa, steel workers from Pennsylvania, baseball players from Texas. They spoke in accents the women could not understand. They neither spat at them nor struck them. Instead, they offered water, a cigarette, a blanket against the morning chill. It was disorienting, even frightening. Everything they had been told about America seemed to collapse in those first quiet hours at sea. The ship groaned as it pushed eastward across the Pacific, carrying these women toward a land they had only known through the lens of hatred. One nurse, just 28 years old, clutched a worn satchel against her chest. Inside was a single photograph of her family back in Kyushu. She thought of the warnings her neighbors had whispered, better to die than fall into American hands. And yet here she was, still alive, still breathing, standing on a ship surrounded by men who did not look like demons at all. The contradiction was unbearable. Fear gnawed at her, but so did curiosity. She lowered her eyes, afraid to stare too long at the tall figure of an American sailor passing by. His boots shined, his face sunburned but calm, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He glanced her way for a moment, not with hatred, not with cruelty, but with something she couldn't quite understand. The Pacific wind cut cold across the deck, and the women pulled closer together. None of them spoke. Each carried her own secret dread of what awaited them in America. But deep inside, each also carried the first, faint spark of a terrifying thought. What if the enemy we feared was not a monster at all, but simply a man? And with that question, their journey truly began. The sun was climbing higher now, painting the endless ocean in silver. On the deck, the women shifted uneasily, clutching what little they had carried from the ruins of their lives. Some of them had been nurses. Their hands, once trained to bandage wounds, now trembled from exhaustion. One young woman had worked in a field hospital on Saipan, where she had watched her closest friends leap from cliffs rather than surrender to the Americans. She carried that memory like a scar, invisible but deep. Another had been a typist in a garrison office. She was barely 21 when American troops stormed the island where she worked. She had never held a weapon. Her only crime had been her uniform, yet now she was bound for a foreign land as a prisoner. Among them was an older woman, a caretaker at a missionary school. She had tried to shield children from the bombing raids, only to be swept up when Japan finally capitulated. Her face, lined with worry, seemed far older than her years. Each woman had her own story, but together they carried the weight of a nation that had crumbled. Japan was not just defeated, it was shattered. Their homeland lay in ruins, cities burned to ash, families scattered, brothers and fathers lost on distant battlefields. Their clothes told the same story. Kimonos tucked under rough army-issue blankets, worn sandals strapped with bits of cloth, photographs folded and refolded until the paper thinned. These were not warriors anymore. They were survivors. The American sailors, walking the deck with rifles slung carelessly, seemed almost like creatures from another world. They were taller, heavier, their faces fuller, their movements relaxed. They looked like men who had never known hunger. The contrast was brutal. Japanese men of the 1940s, worn thin from rationing, rarely reached more than 5'3". The women on the deck had grown used to fragile bodies, hollow cheeks, and constant scarcity. Now, surrounded by these young American sailors with their easy strength, the difference was impossible to ignore. The women tried not to stare, but their eyes betrayed them. Every glance reminded them of what Japan had lost, not only the war, but the illusion that it could ever match such strength. One whispered to another, "If our brothers had eaten as they do, perhaps the war would have been different." Her companion said nothing. She only lowered her eyes, clutching a folded kimono hidden beneath her blanket, a relic of a homeland that now seemed very far away. On that deck, in the middle of the Pacific, these women embodied the collapse of an empire. Their thin frames and haunted faces were living proof that Japan had reached its breaking point. And yet, the journey was only beginning. Ahead lay a land that would challenge everything they thought they knew. For years, these women had been raised on images of America that were designed to terrify. In the newspapers, in classrooms, on posters pasted to crumbling walls, Americans were not shown as men at all, but as demons. Japanese propaganda had drawn them with grotesque faces twisted in malice, sharp claws instead of hands, fangs dripping with blood, giant beasts who would desecrate their families and destroy their homes. In schoolyards, children had been warned that capture meant torture. In villages, loudspeakers blared that American soldiers would kill women on sight. Mothers whispered to daughters that death was better than surrender because the enemy would show no mercy. And so these young women had believed. They had believed it when they watched friends leap from cliffs on Saipan. They had believed it when air raid sirens wailed over Tokyo and Osaka. They had believed it when their fathers left for the front, swearing they would never be taken alive. Now, standing on the deck of an American ship, that whole foundation of fear cracked with every passing hour. The sailors did not leer at them or drag them across the deck. They did not shout insults. Instead, they walked casually, talking among themselves, laughing at small jokes, humming songs. Their rifles were slung loosely, not brandished as threats. To the women, this was deeply unsettling. Not because the men were cruel, but because they weren't. One sailor even approached the group holding out a pack of cigarettes. He tapped it gently, offering one as if to a friend. The women recoiled at first, expecting a trick. But when one finally accepted, the sailor only struck a match, lit it for her, and nodded kindly before walking away. It was a gesture so ordinary that it struck like lightning. This is not what we were told. These are not monsters. The contradictions gnawed at them. If the Americans were not savage beasts, then what else had been a lie? At night, whispers spread among the women as they lay on their bunks. Some admitted the soldiers reminded them of actors they had glimpsed in American films before the war. Others said their smiles were unnerving, too open, too free. Still others confessed the men seemed so tall and strong that they felt like children in comparison. They laughed nervously, but the laughter carried no joy. It carried unease, because beneath every whispered observation lay the same silent question. If the enemy is not what we were taught to fear, then what have we been fighting for all these years? The days at sea began to blend together. Bells marked the hours, footsteps echoed along steel passageways, and the vast Pacific rolled endlessly beneath the ship. At first, the women expected hunger. They had grown used to meager rations in Japan, bowls of watery rice, a scrap of fish when fortune smiled. Their stomachs were small, their bodies already worn thin by years of scarcity. But when the first trays of food arrived, disbelief spread across their faces. Bread, soft, white and fresh. Bowls of steaming soup, thick slices of meat. Coffee, bitter and dark, poured freely into tin mugs. Some of the women stared at the trays as though they were illusions. Others pushed the food away, too nervous to eat, suspecting poison or trickery. Yet the sailors ate the same meals beside them, chewing casually, even joking about the bland taste. To the Japanese women, that blandness was a feast. One whispered to another, "They throw food away." Her voice trembled in wonder and dismay. It was true. What a Japanese family might stretch over 3 days, an American sailor discarded half-eaten without a second thought. The shock deepened with each passing day. Cigarettes handed out like candy, soap bars stacked by the wash basins. Even the hard bunks in the women's quarters, though uncomfortable, were cleaner and sturdier than anything they had known during the war. At night, they lay awake, listening to the hum of engines and the distant laughter of sailors on watch. Some wept quietly into their blankets, mourning a homeland now reduced to rubble. Others stared into the dark, minds churning with questions. How could the enemy have so much when Japan had nothing left? How could a nation at war feed its prisoners better than Japan had fed its soldiers? One nurse, still haunted by the cliffs of Saipan, pressed her face against the porthole. The ocean outside shimmered under the moonlight. She thought of her brother, who had starved on the front lines. She thought of her parents, still rationing scraps back home. And then she thought of the sailors on this ship, laughing, strong, well-fed, and the thought cut deep. The propaganda had promised that Americans were weak, spoiled by luxury, unable to endure hardship. Yet here, at sea, the evidence said otherwise. These men were not weak at all. They were vigorous, confident, alive in ways Japan could no longer imagine. The voyage across the Pacific was supposed to be a journey into captivity. Instead, it was becoming something stranger, more unsettling, a journey into truth. By the 4th night at sea, fear began to loosen its grip, just a little. In its place came something more dangerous, something the women hadn't expected. Curiosity. It started in hushed tones, whispered in the dim light of the barracks after the sailors had finished their rounds. One young clerk leaned closer to her bunkmate and whispered almost guiltily, "They look like the actors in American films." Her friend pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle a laugh. "Don't say such things," she hissed, but her eyes betrayed the same thought. The tall figures, the easy smiles, the confidence, yes, they did resemble the glamorous stars once seen on smuggled posters before the war. Another woman added, "Their teeth, so white, too white, it feels unnatural." The group stifled giggles, the sound sharp and nervous, like children laughing at a funeral. But beneath the laughter was unease. These men were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they looked strong, healthy, even handsome, and that recognition felt almost like treason. During the day, the whispers continued in stolen glances. The women noticed how the sailors teased each other good-naturedly, how one whistled while polishing his boots, how another quietly bowed his head in prayer before his meal. These small gestures were disarming. They were so ordinary, so human, that the women didn't know whether to trust them or fear them more. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as grotesque, weak, and corrupt. Yet the men before them seemed the opposite, vigorous, disciplined, and strangely open. The contradiction rattled them. One evening, as the sun dropped red across the horizon, a sailor paused near the railing where a nurse was standing. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the wind. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, a few feet away, both of them staring at the sea. When he finally said something, his words were in English, soft and almost shy. She didn't understand the language, but she understood the tone. It wasn't anger, it wasn't menace, it was gentle. Her stomach tightened. She turned away quickly, unsettled not by hostility, but by kindness. Back in the bunks that night, the women shared nervous laughter again, whispering about the sailor's smile, about his height, about the way his boots gleamed. One finally confessed what the others were thinking. "They are not what we were told." The laughter stopped. Silence fell heavy in the dark, because everyone knew the truth of it, and none dared say what that truth meant. Morning came with the clang of boots on steel decks. The women stirred from their bunks, their blankets pulled tight against the damp chill. When they rose and stepped onto the open deck, The sight that met them was becoming impossible to ignore. The Americans, they seemed taller each day, as if the ship itself magnified their presence. Broad-shouldered, their uniforms neat, their movements unhurried yet confident. To the Japanese women, the difference in stature was striking, even unsettling. Back home, Japanese men had grown thinner and shorter with each year of war. Years of rationing had carved hollows in their faces and left their bodies wiry and tired. The average Japanese man barely stood 5'3". Here, the sailors loomed 5'8", 5'9", some taller still. Fed on milk, meat, and bread, they carried themselves with the ease of men who had never known true hunger. One woman whispered what they were all thinking. They looked like they were carved from another world. The sight gnawed at them. Japan had preached that Americans were soft, spoiled by their luxuries, unfit for war. Yet here were men who looked stronger, healthier, and more vigorous than the husbands and brothers the women had left behind. The contrast was more than physical, it was emotional. These men laughed freely, their voices rolling across the deck. They whistled tunes, slapped each other's shoulders, moved as though the weight of the war had never truly reached them. To women who had lived under constant fear, blackout drills, and the thunder of air raids, such casual ease seemed almost impossible. A nurse, her eyes dark with memory, thought of her fiancé back in Japan. He had gone to the front rail thin, his teeth yellowed from malnutrition. She pictured him now against the backdrop of these tall, sunburned Americans. The image tore at her, leaving her feeling both angry and ashamed. That shame spread quietly among them. If the enemy was healthier, taller, and stronger, had Japan ever truly stood a chance? One evening, as the sailors lined the deck for roll call, the women could no longer avoid the comparison. They stole glances, then looked away quickly, afraid to be caught staring. Yet in their silence, a shared truth echoed. The Americans did not appear weak at all. They looked like the future, and Japan, in its hunger and ruin, felt like the past. The evening was cool, the kind of sharp Pacific wind that cut through thin clothing and left the women shivering against the railings. They pulled their blankets tighter, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun was sinking in streaks of red and gold. That's when it happened. One American sailor, barely more than a boy, approached slowly with a pack of Lucky Strikes tucked into his hand. He tapped the pack against his palm, then held it out toward the women. His expression was calm, almost casual, like a neighbor offering a light across a backyard fence. The women froze. To them, this was unthinkable. An enemy offering kindness? Surely it was a trick. Some recoiled, eyes wide, clutching their satchels. Others simply stared, uncertain, as if the gesture itself were more frightening than a threat. Finally, one of the nurses, her hands trembling, her face pale, stepped forward. She reached out slowly as though touching fire and accepted the cigarette. The sailor struck a match, shielding it from the wind with his hand. He lit the cigarette for her, nodded once, and walked away. No cruelty, no mockery. Just a simple act, ordinary and human. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouted command. The women exchanged nervous glances, their hearts pounding. The propaganda had promised brutality, humiliation, torture. Instead, they had been given tobacco, a kindness they could neither explain nor accept. The nurse took a shaky drag, coughed, and then whispered, "He meant no harm." The others leaned closer. One muttered, "It must be a trick." Another shook her head slowly. "No," he smiled. And that was the moment it began, the first true crack in the wall of fear and hatred. Because kindness was more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty they had prepared for. Cruelty they could resist with pride and anger, but kindness disarmed them, left them defenseless against doubt. That night in the bunks, they whispered about the sailor. His calm eyes, the way his hand had shielded the match from the wind, the warmth in his nod. Some laughed softly, nervous laughter that masked their confusion. Others lay awake, staring into the dark, haunted by a new and unsettling thought. If the enemy can be kind, then everything we believed, everything we were told, might be a lie. The cigarette was gone by morning, but the doubt remained. It smoldered inside them, hotter than the tobacco ever had. Night came heavy on the transport ship. The ocean hissed below, the steel hull groaned, and inside the women's quarters, whispers replaced sleep. The cigarette had been a spark, more than tobacco, more than smoke. It was proof that the Americans were not what they had been taught, and that realization struck deeper than any blow could have. One young woman whispered into the dark, her voice shaking. "If they are not monsters, then what have we been fighting?" Her words fell like stones. No one answered right away. They didn't have to. Every woman there was thinking the same thing. They had been told since childhood that America was evil, that its people were weak yet cruel, that surrender meant dishonor and torment. Their brothers, their husbands, their fathers had gone to war believing it. Many had died clinging to that belief. Now, on this ship, the belief was unraveling before their eyes. One nurse pressed her palms to her face. She remembered her fiancé, who had chosen death rather than capture. She remembered his last letter, urging her never to trust the enemy. And yet, here she was, still alive. And it was the enemy who had offered her a cigarette, a blanket, even a smile. The guilt was unbearable. Accepting kindness from an American felt like betraying his memory. Yet denying it felt like betraying reality. Another woman, older and hardened by years of war, muttered through clenched teeth, "If this is true, then our suffering was for nothing." The silence that followed was suffocating, because deep down, they all knew the weight of that thought. If America was not what Japan had said, then the war itself, the sacrifices, the hunger, the deaths, was built on lies. Lies that had consumed their families, their homes, their futures. Some wept quietly into their blankets. Others stared into the darkness, hollow-eyed, caught between shame and relief. Shame that they had believed so fully. Relief that perhaps, just perhaps, the enemy was not the nightmare they had been promised. The Pacific wind rattled the portholes. The ship carried them eastward, but their hearts were adrift, lost between loyalty to a fallen homeland and the dawning recognition of a truth they had never been allowed to see. The journey was no longer just about reaching America. It was about confronting themselves. And that was the hardest voyage of all. The nights on the Pacific were long. The ocean stretched dark and endless, broken only by the steady hum of engines and the occasional bark of orders from sailors above deck. Inside the women's quarters, the air was thick with uncertainty. Sleep was shallow. Whispers filled the dark. At first, the whispers were about survival. "Will they separate us?" one asked. "Will we be locked in cells?" Another shivered at the thought. "Perhaps they will parade us through their streets as trophies." But slowly, the tone of the whispers began to shift. The women had seen too much already. Food in abundance, men who smiled, sailors who acted more like neighbors than jailers. Fear still lingered, but curiosity had begun to take root. One clerk whispered timidly, "What if America is not ruins like Japan? What if their cities are still whole?" An older woman scoffed softly, but she too leaned closer, waiting for the answer. "I heard from another prisoner once," the clerk continued, "that they have buildings taller than mountains, that their streets glow with electric lights even at night." The idea was almost too much to believe. For years, Japanese cities had gone dark under blackout orders, their streets reduced to shadows, their nights filled with sirens and fire. To imagine a city glowing at midnight felt like imagining another planet. Another woman spoke up. "They say Americans have machines everywhere. Refrigerators, automobiles, even radios in every home." The group fell silent, picturing such wonders. To them, a refrigerator was a luxury reserved for hospitals or government offices. Automobiles belonged only to the military or the very wealthy, and radios, in Japan, they had been the voice of propaganda controlled tightly by the state. The thought that every American household might own one felt both impossible and threatening. Then came the most dangerous whisper of all. A young nurse, staring into the dark, said softly, "If they treat us kindly now, maybe they will treat us kindly there." The words hung heavy in the air. Some women nodded silently, others clenched their fists as if to push the thought away. Because hope, in its own way, was as frightening as fear. Hope meant that Japan had lied. Hope meant that the enemy was not only stronger, but perhaps better, and that truth was harder to accept than chains. The ship rolled gently, its bow cutting toward the unseen horizon. The women fell into uneasy silence once more, their whispers fading into the drone of engines. But the questions remained, circling in their minds like gulls over dark water. What would they see when they stepped onto American soil? Cruelty, kindness, or a world far beyond anything they had ever imagined? The voyage had been long, but nothing prepared them for the moment land finally rose on the horizon. At first it was just a dark smudge against the morning light, a shape too distant to define. But as the transport ship drew closer, the smudge grew into towers, cranes, and buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly along the coast. The women pressed against the railings, eyes wide, hearts pounding. This was not the broken, hungry America they had been promised in propaganda films. This was something else entirely. The harbor was alive with motion, cargo ships loaded and unloaded in endless rhythm. Cranes swung massive containers through the air with mechanical ease. Trains rumbled across the docks, hauling goods toward factories whose smokestacks poured white plumes into the sky. Everywhere they looked, machines moved with a speed and power they had never seen. One nurse whispered, "This one harbor. It is larger than all of Yokohama." Her companion shook her head in disbelief. "No. Larger still. Look at the ships. There are too many to count." And it was true. The bay was thick with vessels. Tankers, freighters, warships lined like steel mountains. American sailors moved across them in practiced order, thousands upon thousands, each step another reminder of the scale of this nation's strength. Then came the city itself. Skyscrapers rose in the distance, glinting in the morning sun like polished steel. For women who had grown up in wooden houses and narrow streets, the sight of towers scraping the clouds felt impossible. One of them whispered what all were thinking. This country was never touched by war. It was not ruins they saw, but abundance. No bomb craters, no collapsed bridges, no burned-out shells of homes. Instead, streets stretched wide and alive, trucks rumbling, automobiles flashing along boulevards. Smoke from factories marked not destruction, but production. The women's hearts sank, not with fear this time, but with realization. Japan had bled itself dry to fight a nation that had only grown stronger. Tears welled in one nurse's eyes. She thought of her parents, still rationing scraps of rice, and wondered if they could imagine such a place. Could they imagine a land where food seemed limitless, where machines never stopped, where even the air smelled of fuel and industry instead of ash? The ship slid closer to the docks. The women clutched their blankets tighter, staring at the future rushing toward them. This was America, vast, powerful, untouched, and already it was more than they could bear. The transport ship eased into the harbor, its engines rumbling low as ropes were thrown across and cranes swung into place. The women clutched their thin blankets tighter, their breaths shallow. Whatever kindness they had been shown at sea, this was different. Here, in the heart of America, they expected the mask to fall. They shuffled toward the railings, peering down at the docks below. What they saw made their hearts stop. Lined in formation were rows of American soldiers, dozens at first, then hundreds, stretching along the pier. Their uniforms were clean, pressed, their boots gleaming. Helmets caught the sunlight. Their rifles were slung easily, not pointed. But what struck the women most was their size. These men were giants compared to the soldiers they had known back home. Broad shoulders filled their jackets, strong jaws framed their faces. And when they shifted, it was with the relaxed confidence of men utterly at ease in their own land. One of the Japanese women gasped softly, "They are so tall." Another, unable to help herself, whispered the thought that echoed through them all. "They look handsome." The realization brought both shame and wonder. These were the men they had been taught to fear as beasts. Yet here they stood, orderly and calm, like guardians more than conquerors. Their height, their health, their bearing, it was overwhelming. The women exchanged uneasy glances. Some bowed their heads, unwilling to look. Others stared openly, unable to pull their eyes away. A young nurse clutched the railing, her knuckles white. She thought of her brother, who had starved on the front lines, his body frail and weak. Then she looked at these soldiers, well-fed, towering, laughing softly among themselves as they waited. The comparison cut deep. The gangway was lowered with a metallic groan. The women were ordered to prepare to disembark. Their legs shook beneath them, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was awe. Every step down that ramp would take them closer, not just to captivity, but to a world that shattered everything they thought they knew about strength, about dignity, about the enemy. And as the first group of women stepped onto the dock, the American soldiers simply stood at attention, silent and steady, watching. No jeers, no cruelty, just presence. For the Japanese women, it was the final shock. The enemy they had been taught to hate stood before them not as demons, but as men. Men who seemed impossibly tall, impossibly strong, and impossibly human. The gangway groaned under their feet as the Japanese women stepped onto American soil for the first time. The harbor air was sharp with salt and smoke, the clang of machinery echoing from the docks, the hum of a nation alive with energy. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. On one side, the women, fragile and uncertain, clutching their belongings with trembling hands. On the other, the rows of American soldiers, tall, steady, and silent, watching with unreadable eyes. And between them, an ocean of lies collapsing. Everything the women had been told was gone now. The monsters from the propaganda posters were nowhere to be seen. Instead, they saw order, discipline, and yes, even kindness. The soldiers made no move to harm them. No jeers, no threats, only quiet commands to line up, to move forward, to board the waiting trucks. It was almost unbearable, because with every step, the truth pressed harder. Japan had not only lost the war, it had lost the story. One nurse, her eyes filling with tears, thought of her fiancé who had chosen death rather than capture. She thought of the neighbors who had whispered that surrender meant shame worse than death. She thought of the cliff on Saipan where mothers had leapt with their children. And now, standing here, she saw the lie for what it was. The shame was heavy, but alongside it came something unexpected. Relief. Relief that the enemy was not a monster. Relief that survival did not mean dishonor. Relief that the war, with all its hunger and terror, was truly over. The trucks rumbled to life, carrying them away from the docks and deeper into America. Through the slats, the women glimpsed streets filled with cars, homes lit by electricity, shops overflowing with goods. They had stepped into a land that seemed almost unreal. For them, the war had ended not in a battlefield's roar, but in silence, broken only by the sight of tall men standing quietly on a dock, undoing years of fear with nothing more than their presence. The meaning was clear. Propaganda could build walls of hate, but reality had the power to tear them down. And so, as the convoy carried them toward the unknown, The women clutched their blankets and photographs, their whispers fading into thought. They had left Japan defeated, broken, and starved. But in America, they were confronted with something far greater than defeat. They were confronted with truth. And that truth would haunt them, because it meant everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, had crumbled in the space of a single journey across the sea. And so, their journey ended not with violence, but with revelation. For these women, the greatest shock was not America's weapons or soldiers, but the truth itself. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story surprised you most? Was it the power of propaganda, or the simple humanity that broke through it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps us reach more people who love history as much as you do. And of course, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss our next untold tale from World War II. Because trust me, the next story will take you even deeper into the moments that changed the world forever.